right. Well, open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 5. We're going to read around a few different places tonight in preparation for the study on the temple. The Bible takes about a chapter here and describes to us the preparations before the building of the temple. So 1 Kings chapter 5 is primarily where we'll be, but there's a lot of cross-references in this passage that'll get us through. So if you need one of those, just slip up your hand. Our faithful head usher there has your papers for you. So make sure all my kids have one of those to fill out. All right, excellent. All right, 1 Kings chapter 5. It begins, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon." Now, Tyre, by the way, if you're unfamiliar with the location here, is modern-day Lebanon, so just north of Israel on the Mediterranean coast. Because he had heard that Solomon, sent his servants to Solomon because he had heard that they had anointed him king in the place of his father, for Hiram had always loved David. Then Solomon sent to Hiram, saying, this is kind of interesting, when you read different parts of the Bible, this is actually a letter. So we're going to read a letter, and then we're going to read the reply to that letter next. So if you have a Bible like mine, it's actually indented, because actually included in the scripture here is the text of this letter that was sent. So Solomon sent to Hiram, saying, "You know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which were fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to my father David, saying, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, he shall build a house for my name. Now therefore command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servants will be your servants, and I will pay you wages for your servants according to whatever you say. For you know there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians." So these guys were lumberjacks. Kind of makes you wonder if they had those red and black flannel shirts, right? So it was when Hiram heard the words of Solomon that he rejoiced greatly and said, so now we have the return letter. "Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people." And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, "I have considered the message which you sent me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and cypress logs. My servant shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea. I will float them in rafts by the sea to the place you indicate to me, and will have them broken apart there, and you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household." Then Hiram gave Solomon cedar and cypress logs according to all his desire, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20 cores of pressed oil. Thus Solomon gave to Hiram year by year. So the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty together. Then King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts, and they were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens, and 80,000 who quarried stone in the mountains, beside 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies who supervised the people who labored in the work. And the kings commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple. So Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gebalites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stones to build the temple. chapter 6, verse 1, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Father, as we look into your word tonight, encourage us and help us to see how your work is to be done. Father, help us to see the great blessing there is in being involved in your work and in sacrificing and encouraging for it. In Jesus' name, amen. So we have these details that are given from Solomon's construction of the temple. So I want to make sure I always place this for you. So we're kind of slowly laying a brick upon a brick upon a brick to give you understanding of the Old Testament here. So remember, as we come through the Old Testament, we have in Genesis the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Then we have the Exodus, that's Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Caleb. Then we come into the time of the judges, where every man did that which was right in his own eyes, right? And then eventually God brought at the end of this time, through the ministry of Samuel, brought in a united kingdom to Israel. And there were 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. So we're studying the life of Solomon, and eventually that kingdom, which is united under these 3 kings, gets split into 2 after Solomon. So we've been following through, and you remember our little cartoon here. We have looked at how Solomon succeeds David. Now Solomon asks God for wisdom, and then he begins to build a temple. So we're working in and through our book. So as we start talking about the construction of the temple, I want to take you to a couple of different places because there's a lot of significance in the building of the temple. So what we read in 1 Kings has a lot about construction details. The stones, the timbers, what kind of timbers were used. So there is some significance in those things, but when we look at this, I want to make sure we don't miss the forest for the trees, because the big picture look at what's going on across the pages of Scripture has some important things for us. So first of all, I want you to note that the location for the temple building has real significance. Turn with me over to 2 Chronicles. I think you guys are probably familiar with this, but like we have in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all talk about the same period of time, right? It's 4 different perspectives of a single period of time. They all talk about the life and ministry of Jesus. In the Old Testament, we have something similar. 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings form a timeline of Israel's history, but the book of 1 and 2 Chronicles form a parallel timeline. So it's kind of, in a sense, almost like the Gospels of the Old Testament. We have multiple books that are talking about the same period of time. So if you look over in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 3, there's a verse that begins this section about the building of the temple. And I want to make sure I point this out to you because there's a lot of significance here. Now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So you say, well, that's interesting, Pastor. Well, if you get what's going on here, there's some real significance about the site of where the temple is being built. Now, I included this map on the back of your paper, so if you flip over to the back, you can see up a little bit closer. This is a map of Jerusalem during the time of David. So this is David's city. David's palace was built right here up on top, so you can see all of these things. So what we're talking about for the location of the building of the temple is, here's David's city, but there's this hill that is higher up here. So this location, as we read, where the temple is going to be built, is going to have some historic significance. It's Mount Moriah, it's the threshing floor of Ornan, and it is Jerusalem. So if you know your Old Testament really well, those might be familiar to you. But if you don't know your Old Testament really well, let me go back and make sure I tell you some of these stories, because God has been talking about, through the Old Testament, about a place that he is going to choose to put his name. And he has, in a sense, been giving them clues all the way along through the Old Testament that there is a place that is extremely significant in the history of the people of Israel that is ultimately going to be this place. So if you look, now I didn't give you this map, but if you see where this is David's city. Eventually where the temple is going to be built is up here. So you see this is David's city right here, from here down. So that's on this map right here, right? David's city from here down. So what Solomon is going to build is this. Everything from here up. And this is going to be the temple right here. This is going to be Solomon's palace right here. So Solomon, during his lifetime, is literally going to double the size of the city of Jerusalem. And it's largely going to be his palace and the temple. So the city, of course, where this is going to be built is the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, of course, is a special city. It's known as the city of David, but it is located on the site of the ancient city Salem. And if you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 14, you remember the story of Abraham when Lot got in trouble because he was living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and somebody came and pillaged Sodom and Gomorrah and took Lot captive. And Abraham went and chased him down, and with like an army of a couple hundred guys rescued from an army of thousands his nephew Lot. You remember that story? That's all in Genesis chapter 14. And after he came back from the defeat of these kings, he ran into a guy named, you remember his name? He's that kind of spooky character from the Old Testament. And as spooky as, but it's like we don't know where he's from. The book of Hebrews talks about him. His name is Melchizedek. You remember Melchizedek? And it called him the priest of Salem, the king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God. Now, Melchizedek is significant because he was both priest and king. So there's something happening here in the Old Testament. This city, Salem, where Melchizedek lived, is here. This is the ancient city of Salem where Jerusalem is being built. So you remember Melchizedek is at least a picture of Jesus, if not a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus himself in Genesis chapter 14. So this is Melchizedek's city, where Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek, and the Lord is worshipped here. So the rabbis, of course, claim that Jerusalem is a combination of Shem and Abraham's name for the place. Now, I think I gave you some more detail in here that I have on the PowerPoint, detail on your handout. But the Jewish rabbis teach that Shem was the one who founded the city, the son of Noah, and he named it Salem, or Shalom in Hebrew, which would, of course, mean peace. And that Abraham, of course, when he came and offered Isaac here on Mount Moriah, he named the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, right? So the rabbis claim that Jerusalem comes from Jireh, the Jireh part of Jehovah Jireh, God provides, and Salem from Shem. So you can see that there's a lot of significant history. The location of the temple was the top of Mount Moriah. This is where Abraham took Isaac to offer him to the Lord. So you can see as you're reading through the book of Genesis, this is now Genesis 22, we have two significant events happening in this place. Abraham is meeting Melchizedek, who is a priest and a king, who is significant theologically. Abraham goes up here to Mount Moriah to offer Isaac. Now, the last specific thing that happened on this site was in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And if you remember this story, when David was a little bit older in his reign, he numbered the people. And it was something that he wasn't supposed to do. And God gave him a choice. How do you want to be punished? Remember the story? And I feel like I said Abraham. I meant David if I said Abraham. Okay, we're talking about David. So David really looked at the Lord and said, Lord, how can I choose? Be merciful to us. And the Lord sent an angel that was destroying the people. People were dying. So as they were coming in, as that angel was coming toward the city of Jerusalem, I'm going to go back here. That angel was coming toward the city from the south, and David prayed for God's mercy, and God stopped that angel on the top of Mount Moriah on a threshing floor that was owned by a guy named Ornan. So that angel stopped there. God showed mercy to the people. So David built an altar up there and offered sacrifices to the Lord in gratefulness to his mercy. So what David did then is he purchased the threshing floor from Ornan. And so this is a significant place, right? There's a lot of things happening here. This is a place where God's mercy is shown. This is a place where priest and king are together. This is a place where Abraham is displaying really one of the ultimate expressions of faith that we have in the Scriptures, to be willing to sacrifice his own child. So this location is very important. So the location of the temple was Mount Moriah, where Abraham took Isaac to offer him, and the specific site was Ornan's threshing floor. So this is the place, and it's a very significant place. So this is the location, and then number two, we have the construction timing. So the Bible is helping to place this for us. In fact, the statement that begins 1 Kings chapter 6. If you go back to our chapter there, 1 Kings chapter 6, the statement that's made here is an extremely important statement for biblical chronology. So it tells us that it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel. Solomon began to build the temple. So when you look at how we understand biblical chronology, because Solomon was so famous, secular history all over the world has record of Solomon, and when he built the temple, and when it was dedicated. So this statement right here allows us to date almost the entire Old Testament, because we have a significant event that was known worldwide, that we can compare biblical history to secular history and have a really good idea of when everything happened. Because we know when the temple was built, we know when it was dedicated, we know how many years it was, all the way back to the Exodus. So we read something like this, and while our hearts aren't moved by the numbers that are given to us, these numbers have great significance as we talk about the reliability of the Scriptures, because we're able to look at secular history and we're able to look at biblical history, and as Christians, we're able to point at this and go, you say the Bible's all wrong, but you look at your own history. It's right. And we can prove it's right. And all the numbers line up the way that they're supposed to. So the timing of this really is interesting. It really is important. So what's going to happen as we begin reading chapter 5, if you go back there, Solomon is building a relationship with King Hiram of Tyre, and he's going to do it immediately following his coronation. So we find that in verse 1. When Hiram hears about Solomon's coronation as king, David is dead, Solomon is now the sole king of Israel, he sends like an ambassador down to congratulate Solomon. And it begins a discussion between the two about being able to get together and do a trade deal, so that Israel is able to take what they have a lot of, which happens to be wheat and olive oil, and trade it with Lebanon for something that they have a lot of, which is mountains and trees. So it ends up working out really well. So Solomon, immediately when he takes over as king, knows exactly where he is going and what he is doing. He's going to make this deal with Hiram because he knows number one on his list is what? The building of the temple. So immediately as he comes in, first order of business, boom, trade deal with Hiram, let's get this going, because if I'm going to build the temple, we got to get materials first, right? I mean, we live in an age where if we need stuff, we go to we go to Home Depot or Menards. Man, you catch Menards when they got that 11% off, right? I mean, you can actually come out pretty good if you hit Menards when you go and do the 11% off. It comes back in a rebate, but we all know we're going back anyway, so it's like free money, right? So we just go to Menards, or if you're, you can buy all kinds of construction stuff there. If you need more, you can of course go to a lumber company, and they're going to have the trusses or whatever you need, or larger amounts of lumber. But you remember, in this day, there's no lumber store. So we ran into this when we did a mission trip a few years ago to Romania. Romania just didn't have at that time, didn't have like Home Depot or Menards or anything like that you could go to. So when we were looking for some lumber to build a small porch on the back of a mission house that we were working on, they had to go to an open bazaar where there was piles of wood laying around. This is Romania. This is Europe. This isn't Africa. This is Europe. And they had to go pick rough cut lumber out of a pile to try and work with. That's the best they had to offer. So, we're so used to having, right at hand everything we need. It's different. So Solomon knew they were going to need a lot of stone and they were going to need a lot of timber for all the buildings. So right away, this is what he does. So he proposes a trade deal with Hiram that would allow the collection of construction resources. We read about that in 2 through 9. Solomon essentially says, hey, you got trees. We got wheat. Let's make a deal. So, like you're there in the pit game, when Solomon's got his wheat, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, and Hiram's out there with his trees going 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. We can figure this out, right? So they have their construction resources. So it took approximately 4 years, and if you look at chapter 5, verse 1, the coronation of Solomon, and you look at chapter 6, verse 1, the construction begins 4 years after the coronation. So Solomon spent the first 4 years, the first 10% of his reign, literally just assembling materials for the construction of the temple. 4 years. That's a long time, isn't it? But this is a massive project. And it's a project, frankly, that is still visible today. The temple was going to be built about 1,000 years before Christ. So do your math on that. This is 3,000 years ago. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can see these stones that this passage is talking about. You can actually go see them. They are still there in Israel today. That's what the West Wall is, or the Wailing Wall. It's these stones that this passage is talking about. So if you think about this, a project of this magnitude is something that has lasted. Is there anything else that's 3,000 years old that's still out there? So not many things. So it took 4 years to assemble the stone and the timber to begin the construction. So when you look at this story and you put this all together, it is really interesting. And I want you to go with me back to 1 Chronicles. So these are on your handout. In fact, if I could have a little bit of help to read these, I would love to get somebody else's voice going tonight other than mine. So I'm sure we'd all appreciate that. Could I have some volunteers to read here? 1 Chronicles 21, 22 to 25. All right. We'll start in the front and work our way back here. So Jennifer, you got those. It's there on your handout. 1 Chronicles 21, 22 to 25. All right. Then the next one is 1 Chronicles 22, 14 to 16. Sandy, you good with that? All right. All right. And then 1 Chronicles 29, 1 through 9, a little longer. Coral, still good with that? All right. And then Deuteronomy 11, 13 to 15. All right. Tiffany. All right. So you remember David was the one who wanted to build the temple. He had it in his heart. He had a deep love for God. You remember he was the man after God's own heart. And David wanted to build a temple. But God told him no. And it's a really interesting part of the story where David was not allowed to do it. But even though God would not allow him to build it, David had already prepared significant resources for the temple construction. So 1 Chronicles 21, 22 to 25, David is going to purchase the land where the temple is going to be built. So go ahead. All right. So remember the story here. David wants to buy it from Ornan. Ornan says, David, you're the king. This huge thing is going on here. You can have it for free. David said, no, I'm not taking it for free. I'm going to pay you because this is for the Lord. So it's not going to be for free. So David purchased that, and this is where the temple is going to be built. So the land purchased, but not by Solomon, but by David. Number 2, David personally gave a literal fortune. See, and this is the proper use of this word, by the way, for my children. Okay. Literal. This is how it is. David personally gave a literal fortune of gold, silver, iron, and bronze. So, Sandy, you have these. All right. So you see David is starting to throw out numbers, right? About how much gold and how much silver. We actually hit 1 million talents of silver. I mean, this is a literal fortune. And David has this all set aside. Now, it's interesting. David, it said, began setting aside timber and stone. But what did he tell? He's actually speaking to Solomon at this point. What did he tell him? I've set aside some timber and stone, but what are you going to need to do? This is verse 14. You're going to need to add to them. So David began to assemble timber and stone, but he's telling Solomon right away, but I don't have enough of this yet. So what is it that Solomon immediately begins to try to procure at the beginning of his reign? He makes a deal with Hiram for what? Timber and stone. Why is he not looking for gold and silver and bronze and iron and all of these other things? Because David set aside all of those things already. So all they need is timber and stone. So Solomon already knows. There's like a plan and operation that has been made since before he was even king. David set this all up. And aside from this, David is going to organize an offering from the nation to build the temple. So just like in the Old Testament, when they built the tabernacle, after they left Egypt, they took up an offering, a free will offering from the people to say, hey, this is what we're doing. We want to build the temple, or build the tabernacle. like God has commanded us to do. And the people brought all of the resources and they gave them. So look at 1 Chronicles 29, 1 through 9. Right, so you can see that David has set aside a literal fortune. Now he's calling to the nation and the leaders, and he's saying, okay, this is what we're doing. This is a great work that needs to be done. Would you be willing to give? And the people gave generously, and they pooled all of these resources for the building of the temple, but it wasn't Solomon who did this, it was David who did this. So even though God wouldn't allow him to build it, David had already prepared significant resources for the construction. So as Solomon comes to build Solomon's temple, it's almost kind of as much David's temple as it is Solomon's temple, isn't it? But not even just that, it really belongs to the whole nation, because the whole nation has been a part of this. The whole nation has been part of building it. The whole nation is going to be part of this. So it's really interesting as you look at this. We're reading this in 1 Kings. But, I mean, if you're Solomon, all you have to do is just do what's already been set up for you. I mean, Dad kind of made this whole thing go. But Solomon now is going to bring his wisdom in, and it's going to, the Bible's actually going to specifically mention the wisdom of Solomon. And that's going to be in the trade deal that he sets up here with King Hiram. It's going to be in the organization of the labor force, because now you've got a massive amount of resources to do a massive job. But how are you going to get it all done? So that's where Solomon comes in. He brokers the deal with Hiram that resulted in the trade of wheat and lumber for stone. So we kind of already talked about that. And you say, well, how in the world did Israel get this much? Did you see the numbers, the cores of wheat? I think this is really interesting. So if you do the math on this, a core, according to the rabbis, is 45 gallons. So if they have 20,000 cores of wheat, that comes out to 900,000 gallons of wheat. Now this is what Solomon gave to Hiram every single year. How much wheat is that? So I can illustrate this for you, I think, very well. Have you ever seen one of these before? An Olympic-sized swimming pool. You know how much water an Olympic-sized swimming pool has in it? About 660,000 gallons. So roughly every year, Solomon gave an Olympic-sized swimming pool and a half full of wheat to Hiram. That's a lot of wheat. I mean, how many sprigs of grass, or how many seeds do you think you need to plant to get 660,000? How many fields need to be harvested? And remember, they're not running the combine through this, right? They're doing this all by hand. They're cutting those all down. That's an incredible amount of prosperity, wouldn't you say? Now, they're also giving 20 cores of fine olive oil. So this is 900 gallons. So that's maybe a little bit more of a smaller number you can get your hand around, but picture 5-gallon buckets, right? That's a lot of them, full of olive oil. So a ton, I mean literal tons. See, again, the actual use of that word. Literal tons of food Solomon is sending every year. That's amazing prosperity, isn't it? And this is over and above what the people are eating and what the people are using. So let's go back and take a look at that again real quick. Israel's prosperity. How is it that Israel is so prosperous at this point? Well, there's a simple answer to that question, and it is this. Israel's prosperity is linked to their obedience to the Palestinian covenant. You remember before Israel came in to the nation, God made a deal with them. It actually says at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, I'm setting before you today a choice, life or death, blessing or cursing. So again, I'll give you the Pastor Ray paraphrase, don't be dumb, obey, right? It's a very simple equation. Obey me, love me, follow me, and I'll take care of you and everything that you need. So specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 to 15, this is what God said. That's you, babe. I'm sorry, Tiffany, could you read that for us, please? All right, so God lays it out very simply for him, right? Love me with all of your heart, obey my commandments, and you're going to find fields that are full of wheat, vineyards that are full of grapes, and olive groves that are full of olives. And you're going to bring in all of these things. So what do we see here? We see Israel at a time in their history under godly leadership where the people are following and worshiping God. And what's going on in the nation? Amazing prosperity that now they're able to use to do something amazing for the Lord. So Solomon is going to give this wheat. The Bible tells us this wheat and this olive oil every year. They're going to send it up. And Hiram is going to send down the logs and the stones. So it's interesting. The logs are rafted and floated down the Mediterranean shore. So they're going to cut all the trees. And rather than dragging them through the dirt, they're going to bring them down to the ocean, and they're going to float them down the ocean to make the distance. Smart. I would imagine there's probably something with the salt water as well, maybe curing the logs and preventing rot. I would imagine there's probably something to do with that as well. But they're going to float all these logs down the shore. They're going to bring them down to a place in Israel. Again, you can actually go down through history, and you can actually see in history that I think it was it? I forget the name of the city in particular, but it's known for its timber. Well, there's no trees in that area. Why is that area known for its timber? Well, that's because that's where they were floated and brought down. So Solomon also is then going to raise a labor force. So if you're going to build a building, right, you need construction materials, but then you also need men to do the work, right? So how are they going to get people to do the work? So Solomon is going to raise a labor force to source and transport all of these building materials. And he does something here which is really ingenious. It's kind of a biblical version of shift work. Now, we've done shift work before. You know, we've worked the swing shift, the 5/8 or the 3-2-2, you know. And if you really want to get something going, you know, shift work is a fantastic way to get this going. So what they did is they devised this shift work. Now, if you look at this and if you kind of read the nuance, what Solomon is doing here is he is hiring 30,000 Jewish men to work in Lebanon on rotation. So there's going to be 30,000 men. They're going to be 3 groups of 10,000 men. And they're all going to go for a month. So they're 1 month on, 2 months off. So in a sense, they're working off the farm for 1 month, and then they're working on the farm for 2 months. And that's the way they went. Now, this is a fairly desirable option, isn't it? To have 4 months of work off the farm and 8 months of work on the farm. And the rotation, if it works out properly for you, depending upon when your barley comes in and when your wheat comes in and when your olives are ripe, okay, and when your vineyards are ready to go, this actually ends up working out pretty good, right? So Solomon's kind of got this all figured out, and he's got all of these people organized where now he's hiring the Jewish people to do this work and to have the finances to do this, because they have literally 1 million talents of silver. They have how many, 100,000 talents of gold. They've got all these precious stones. They have the resources to do this. So they hire 30,000 Jewish men. Now, in addition to that, Solomon is going to conscript a labor force of 153,300 men who are going to quarry and transport the stone. Now, these people, if you read between the lines here and connect it with the book of Chronicles, these are actually going to be a conscripted labor force. Now, they are probably receiving pay, but they don't have a choice whether or not they're going to join. These are actually Canaanites. So there's a very interesting picture here. The Jewish people were not allowed to enslave their own brothers, but the Canaanites they were, so they conscripted the Canaanites so that they were still in conjunction with the Old Testament law, and hired the Jewish men to come and labor. So now we've got 183,000 people just gathering materials. That's a lot of people for one project. So Solomon's labor force is going to include both Jews and Gentiles. You're going to read this at the end of the chapter there, where it says they've got Jewish men, they've got these Canaanites, they've got the Gebalites, who are all working together, as well as Hiram's people, all doing this all together to get everything necessary to bring this construction project together. So 4 years in the making, but even much more than that, right? So Solomon, for 4 years, is putting these things together. So let's talk about some applications, because it's interesting historically to talk about this, but what can we learn from this? Well, number one, love for God materializes in giving his work priority. When you look at Solomon, Solomon loved the Lord, right? David loved the Lord. And the Bible is very clear about that. Well, if you love God, what happens? Remember, love we state this a number of different ways, but love is an action, right? You're going to find anytime love shows up, genuine God-honoring love, it is always motivating to action, right? So we start in places like John 3:16. For God so loved the world, so he gave. And what does love do? Okay, love gives. Love works. Love prioritizes. Love is that motivation that always materializes into something. You can't touch or feel love, like you can't see it, but you can see it, right? Like the wind. You can't see the wind, you can't touch the wind, but you definitely know the wind is there, right? Because the trees are blowing, or in some cases are blowing over. Joe and I were out trying to get his duck blind, and we're out there pulling everything down, and we're going to hook it up to the boat and pull it out, and the wind kicked up. This was it this last Saturday? And we watched a tree blow down over where the marsh walk was. We both looked at each other and went, I'm not pulling this thing out on the river, because that wind is going to push this thing over. So love materializes. And what does it materialize into? Putting God first. And how did David do that? He gave a fortune because he wanted to see a house built for God. He assembled timbers, all of this stuff. I mean, David is doing an awful lot to bring all of these things together. Solomon, day number 1, he's coronated. What does he do? Let's get the rest of it together. And he assembles materials for 4 years. Boom, here we go. This is number 1. So love for God materializes in giving his work priority. Number 2, generosity and sacrifice for God's work are a source of blessing. Did you notice the last verse Coral read for us? They took up an offering, right? Big offering. Everybody's given gold and silver, precious stones. And how does it finish in 2 Chronicles 29:9? What does it say? Anyone remember? I see Jennifer's looking it up there. Nope, I might have 1 Chronicles 29:9. 1 Chronicles 29:9. All right. The people rejoiced because they had given willingly. So, we don't talk a lot about giving in the church here, but we bring it up when it comes up, right? And here it comes up. These people are giving, and are giving generously. And what are they doing as they're putting their money figuratively in the offering plate? There goes my new car. Oh, that was my cabin up north. What are they saying? They're rejoicing, right? Because generosity and sacrifice for God's work are sources of blessing. This is joy, People are truly giving in joy. And nobody's being constrained. The sheriff of Nottingham isn't over there, shaking the, shaking the kid's cast so the money falls out. You remember from the Robin Hood cartoon, right? So nobody's forcing anybody to do anything, but as people are giving generously and sacrificing for the work of the Lord, they are rejoicing greatly because they get to be a part of something that God is doing. And that's a cool thing when you get to be a part of something that God is doing. So it's definitely the kind of heart that should carry through even into our age today. Number 3, God's work should include careful planning and organization. Sometimes when it comes to doing the Lord's work, we feel like we should lean on a shovel and pray for a hole, if I can put it that way. Like we're just kind of waiting around for God to do. So we lean on the shovel and pray for the hole. So God's work takes careful planning, takes organization, it takes work. And Solomon, in bringing this all together, look at everything that's involved in the building of the temple. They're not just saying, God, please provide for the temple. Solomon is forging trade deals. There's people who are harvesting the wheat, and they're buying it, and they're bringing it up there, and they're trading it. We've got 180-some thousand people engaged in just bringing these resources to Jerusalem for the building. And remember, they're not loading this stuff on semi-trucks with cranes, right? They're not even necessarily putting these things on carts. These are drags, and people are pulling these things. And this is a massive amount of really heavy work. And if you look at those stones, the ones you can see from the foundation of the temple that are still there today, they're big and they're heavy. And it took a lot of organization and careful planning to bring this all together and to keep this working. And it really does take that, keep this working. And it really does take that. Nothing happens by accident. And while we pray, and certainly the work must be done by God, that doesn't mean that we don't sweat and plan and work along the way, right? And then number 4, I thought it was just maybe a good note to remind us that God's work can employ skillful labor by believers and unbelievers. Now, we're never going to ask an unbeliever to come and stand in the pulpit, right? Because that's not the place. But there are times when Just like in the building of Solomon's temple, they needed people who were going to do the fine stonework. They had people come from Tyre to do the fine stonework because they didn't know how to do it. So we hire CPAs sometimes to do work, right? Whether they're Christian or not Christian. Sometimes we look for Christians to be involved in this if we can. But it's okay. The church is going to at times hire people that we need in order to do what we need to do because we don't know how to do it. And that's an okay thing. You know, unbelievers can be involved in this sense in the work that God is doing. And yeah, they were hired, and to them it was just another job. But it is certainly something that can be done along the way. So everything's coming together, right? So now 4 years, they're collecting stone and timber. David's already got a literal pile of materials. And everything is set and ready to go. So we'll talk next time about the building then of the temple. We'll talk about the furniture, the layout, the significance of those things as we go forward, because there's a lot of meaning in the building of the temple. So we won't read through the accounts necessarily word for word on all of them and all the detail, but I'll make sure I summarize them for you so you can get the significant portions of it in the coming weeks. All right, I think that's where we'll finish for tonight. Look forward to seeing you again on Sunday morning at 9:30 when it's still light out. Have a great night.